Friends, I am Lieutenant General Amit Sharma, former Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Forces Command of the Nuclear Forces of the country. Today I shall speak to you on the Indian nuclear doctrine, or the philosophy that guides strategy, covering the hows, whens and wheres of the employment of nuclear weapons. Even before we got our independence in 1947, we had eminent people like Dr. Homi Bhabha, who realized the power of the atom and the usefulness of nuclear energy for peaceful development of the country. It was because of this that in early 50s, we started the three-stage nuclear program, the aim of which was in the decades to come to become totally self-sufficient in the expertise, technology, to be able to exploit the natural resources of thorium that we had for nuclear energy. It was a part of this three-stage program that we went in for the peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. Now, despite the fact that we had the wherewithal and the knowledge to go in for nuclear weapons in 1974, we chose not to do it because as a nation, we believed that nuclear weapons were not for war fighting and nuclear weapons should be banished from the face of the earth. The destruction that the world had seen in 1945 was enough to make the world realize that these weapons should not be used. However, 28 years later, in 1998, in Pokhran in May, we went into 5 nuclear explosions and declared ourselves a nuclear weapon power. This was, like I brought out earlier, was purely because of national security reasons. Along with the power that the nation had because of nuclear weapons, came the realization that we had to be more responsible and more mature. As also we needed to have clear-cut rules for the holding and employment of nuclear weapons. It is very remarkable that within 15 months of us declaring ourselves as a nuclear weapon power, that the country went in or announced the draft nuclear doctrine. This was a doctrine made by the Cabinet Committee on Security, and after 1999, it was discussed for 4 years. We hear a lot about our doctrine in newspapers and even from Indian analysts. There's a lot that can be changed. Of course, it has been discussed, and what we finally produced in 2003 was a doctrine that had been discussed and thrashed out in totality, and the government gave a very clear 8-point doctrine which covered as to how and when would we use our nuclear weapons. February 2003, that the Cabinet Committee on Security announced a nuclear doctrine, and it was put on the internet for public consumption. And what I'm talking today is what is there on the internet, and I would request people after hearing me, they must go through it and see what the government has written. The Indian nuclear doctrine is a very precise 8-point doctrine. I shall explain to you what the doctrine is and thereafter come to 2 points which I feel are the focal points in the nucleus of the doctrine. It is based on this doctrine that 1, the force structuring has been done, and 2nd, the method of employment has been done. The first point of the doctrine was build and maintain a credible minimum deterrent. We follow a policy of no first use. Nuclear weapons will be used only in retaliation against a nuclear attack on Indian territory or on Indian forces anywhere. Now, the catchword here is anywhere. Even if the Indian forces are on foreign soil and a nuclear weapon is used against us by that country, we reserve the right to retaliate in the manner we deem fit, which is the next point. Nuclear retaliation to a first strike will be massive to inflict unacceptable damage. So what the government has brought out is very clear. 1, no first use, but in case somebody uses nuclear weapons against us, we have only one answer, and that is massive retaliation to inflict unacceptable damage. The next point as to who can authorize a nuclear strike. The doctrine clearly says that nuclear retaliation attacks can only be authorized by the civilian political leadership through the Nuclear Command Authority. This implies that the nuclear weapons and their employment are under the Nuclear Command Authority, which is headed by the Prime Minister of the country. India will not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. This is very self-explanatory because we've said unless we are hit, we will not hit back. But we've also brought out that in case of a major attack causing mass destruction on Indian forces anywhere by chemical or biological weapons, India will retain the option of retaliating with nuclear weapons. Now, the difference here between nuclear and chemical or biological weapons is that in case of a nuclear strike, a massive retaliation is guaranteed. But in case of a chemical or a biological strike, we retain the option of going in for a nuclear strike. That means the options are still open. And the last 2 points has what has always been the philosophy of the country, is that one, we are committed to non-proliferation, and finally, our goal remains of a nuclear weapons-free world. I shall now touch upon the 2 points which I feel form the nucleus of this nuclear doctrine, and that is no first use and massive retaliation. Now, what exactly do we mean by a first strike? There are a lot of questions which are asked that if you see the enemy preparing to assault or preparing to launch a strike, will that be counted as a first strike? Or a launch on warning, can you launch a thing? No, I want to clarify that it is etched in stone that unless a nuclear weapon strikes Indian forces, it will not be taken as a first strike. Because there can be options for the purposes of brinkmanship. You could have an enemy country preparing the nuclear weapons. But our doctrine is one, it leads to a lot of stability because any aggressor should be very clear that we will not launch nuclear weapons unless we absorb a first strike. And thereafter, we will carry out massive retaliation. Now, these 2 points, to be able to absorb a first strike, that means to absorb a certain amount of destruction and damage, and then be able to carry out nuclear retaliation in a massive manner, is what leads us to our force structuring, including command and control systems. Because when we absorb a first strike, what all could be hit? Firstly, the Nuclear Command Authority, the people who are commanding the nuclear weapons. Second, it could be the nuclear command posts from where the orders are given. Third, it could be the launch systems itself. And fourthly, it could be a nuclear warheads. And lastly, it could be the places where the warheads and the nuclear weapons and the launch systems are kept. So in order to absorb a first strike, we have to have backups of everything. And you must have adequate numbers that even if 60, 70, 80% of weapons and things is destroyed, you are still in a position to carry out massive retaliation. And therefore, when we talk of what are the numbers that are needed for credible minimum deterrence, we cannot really specify a number. But the numbers have to be adequate enough to absorb a first strike, whatever that be, which will depend on which are the nations that we are worried about, how are they increasing their arsenals, what are the threat assessments, and therefore we go in for numbers that even after a certain amount of destruction that we're going to take, we should be able to retaliate. That means even for the Nuclear Command Authority headed by the political leadership, we have to have backups and backups to backups, so that there should be no situation where there is nobody left to pass orders for the employment of nuclear weapons. And that is why I said that these 2 points form the focal points of the nuclear doctrine. As also, if the enemy knows that India will not retaliate, a number of points has come up that would a no first use contribute to stability, or will it work the other ways? India strongly believes that if the aggressor knows that India will not use its nuclear weapons unless we are physically hit, they will not use their nuclear weapons because they know that if they use something against us, the answer is only massive retaliation to inflict unacceptable damage. A number of times people have asked, what do you mean by unacceptable damage? Now, this is something which I leave to the audience, because if you were the leader of any country and you were to be subjected to a nuclear strike, what would you claim as damage which is unacceptable? So this is something which has to be left open. The point that comes up is, that our neighbors have developed low-yield weapons called tactical nuclear weapons. And in case a low-yield weapon was used against us, causing negligible damage, would it be right to resort to massive retaliation? And this question has been asked not just by the people who are using TNWs or the world outside, but even by our own defense people. Our answer is very clear. The aim of Indian nuclear weapons is to deter the use of any nuclear weapon against us. And therefore, even if a tactical weapon, be it 1, 2, or 10, is used against us, we are treating it as a strategic weapon, and our answer is only massive retaliation. Another question that is generally asked is that with the advent of TNWs on the battlefield, is there space for conventional war? My answer is yes, for a very basic reason that we also are a nuclear weapon power. And our doctrine is very clear. If any nuclear weapon is used against us, irrespective of the yields, be it a tactical nuclear weapon, we treat it as strategic, and the answer is massive retaliation. In fact, what is heartening to see is that even the Americans, in the Nuclear Posture Review 2018, released in February this year, they clearly state that if China or Russia uses limited amount of nuclear weapons against us, their answer will be massive retaliation, where the results will be incalculable. So they are saying exactly what we've been saying since 2003. Therefore, I feel that as a nuclear weapon power, there is adequate space for conventional war. And if we are forced, which we have never started a war, but if forced, the objectives will not be governed by our adversaries' nuclear weapons, but by the political objectives laid down by the government of India. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude by reiterating 3 points. India does not want nuclear weapons to stay, and we are still retaining our weapons because of reasons of national security. Second, our nuclear weapons are not aimed against any particular country, but the aim of our nuclear weapons is to deter anybody from using nuclear weapons against us. And finally, the philosophy and the thought of the country does not change. We are fully committed to nuclear non-proliferation and the destruction or denuclearization in a complete and a verifiable and a non-discriminatory fashion. Thank you very much.